And hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of Theology Without Walls. We really appreciate you joining Presence for this discussion. Per usual, Presence is excited to have our own partners here on a live Zoom call, which we are recording. This is a discussion that Presence has been having now for some decades, and certainly in the last 20 years, we've had a lot of discussion that lends itself to a theology without walls. And we are offering material and diagrams and our systematic theology, if you will, for those who are not familiar with Presence or the Presence material and how we come to this place. So for any of you who are not familiar with Presence, thanks for joining us today. I'm going to do my best to start giving you an outline, and we're going to develop that outline in another session or two. Last week, I brought in Dr. Jerry Martin, who has been stellar in bringing this to the forefront and sticking with it. I read a number of his quotes, and what Theology Without Walls is not. It is not pluralism. It is not interreligious dialogue. It is not interfaith discussion. It is not multiple belonging. It is something beyond those walls. And that this should not be anything surprising to us when we look at the trajectory of worldviews that have been going on. We used the model of spiral dynamics last week to show that you basically have three hermeneutical approaches to Christology. You have the traditional approach to Christology, which began 2,000 years ago, because this is when the Gospels, the apostolic writings appeared, is right in the heart of the traditional worldview era. And that era produced something that looks a whole lot like empire and institution. In other words, we said Jesus was institutionalized from the very beginning because that's the lens through which they looked. And it should not be surprising that in the traditional era, you have very fundamentalistic attitudes that are, first of all, you do not question authority. You do not question the Caesar. You do not question the Pope. That you have a male hierarchy and a structure of Caesar and generals and lieutenants and centurions, or you have a Pope and cardinals and bishops and priests, and those things look amazingly alike. And all of that is structured in the traditional worldview and the hermeneutics that go with it. And then we saw that in modernity, which came here in the West in around 1500 with Renaissance and Enlightenment, it is no surprise that Luther shows up here. And one of the keys of modernity is, for the first time, people begin to question. This did not happen in the traditional age. And so you have a new hermeneutic that's also brought into the world of Christology. That hermeneutic is deconstruction. Let's question these traditional views. Let's question whether or not the Bible is also a scientific book. And so you have the separation of science and religion. Let's question whether or not the Pope is the ultimate and only authority. Let's question whether or not we should use Gutenberg's printing press, which, oh, by the way, was a product of modernity, to get the narrative itself, the biblical narrative, in the hands of everyone out there. And then, of course, we have many things that develop a number of different denominations called Protestant. Now, the latest view to appear on the planet is postmodernism, and postmodernism desires to find a way to be more and more inclusive. And so that's the great side of postmodernism. Postmodernism really does want to get away from the blue meme traditional hermeneutic of, I am part of the one true church. We have Jesus, who's the one true way, and we are the true believers, and everything outside of our denomination is a false way, a false religion, etc., etc. And so postmodernity is really looking for more inclusion, wanting a whole lot more inclusion. And this is a good thing. Now, one of the challenges of that is that postmodernity is also notorious for relativizing because when you want everyone included, you do your best to relativize everything so that everything can be accepted. And there have been some real problems with that. Postmodernity is what has brought us interfaith discussion. Interfaith dialogue was not part of the original hermeneutics applied to the development of Christology.
Can you explain hermeneutics?
And so, yeah, so hermeneutics, for those who may be watching this outside of academia, is certainly the different ways, the way in which people interpret, make meaning of their stories and narratives. What is your hermeneutic? What is it? Everybody brings something. Everyone brings something to the text when you don't come out of a vacuum. And that's why last week and in the first episode, I went through all the different world levels, because where we're coming from is we're coming from the three world levels that have brought three flavors of Christology. Christology has been traditional, it's been modern, and it's been postmodern. The one thing that Christology has in common with all three worldviews for the last 2,000 years is that you always end up with a religion. That is the common thread of the traditional, modern, and postmodern hermeneutics that go with those worldviews, and that is that Christology always ends up as a religion. We ask the question, though, what happens when we take an integral approach, which is a postmodern? In other words, the next step in the development of spiritual consciousness and our understanding of it. We ask the question, well, what would that look like? And that's what we're talking about now. And so the movement from traditional to modern to postmodern was a difference of degree, meaning there's a difference in the degree to which you have a Christological religion. But once we move into the integral realm, it's a difference of kind, because we are now going trans-religious. We are now going beyond religion as an interpretation of Christology. We are saying that the role of Jesus was not to become the founder of a world religion so that his cross symbol could be put on a bumper sticker along with all the other religious symbols, and we could all try to coexist. Coexistence is a great step forward in evolution. We're not denigrating anyone's worldview, interpretation, or where they are in their personal journey. We're not here to try to tell anyone who is in a fundamentalist group that they should evolve. And I don't think anybody watching this video who has come from fundamentalism, and you're a progressive theologian even, if you're a progressive theologian, your goal is not to go out and inject yourself into fundamentalist groups. They're on their page, they're doing what they do, and all we're saying is that we are moving beyond that fundamentalism. Now, one final thing, and then I'll look at some diagrams here. Generally speaking, when you move or feel like you have evolved beyond fundamentalism, and you begin presenting ideas that's beyond where they are, it's not unusual that they will feel like they're under attack. That, oh, I see, you're more evolved than us. Oh, I see, you are this, you are that. And so there's a natural tendency to feel attacked by a progressive, for example, if you're a fundamentalist. Likewise, I want to emphasize that Presence is not attacking postmodernists who are still interpreting Christology as a variety of denominational religions. What we're saying is that we want to offer to anybody who is interested a view beyond religion, and not use that as an attack, because spiral dynamics as a model, as an example, is telling us that everyone has the right to evolve. Everyone has a right to their own journey. So that's where we're going to move forward. So I want to put up a diagram right now. This is a real basic shell diagram. We're going to fill it in as we go along. And it's going to explain our trajectory, if you will, which I have right there in front of you. And that trajectory says that when we study the biblical narrative and we have an approach to theology without walls, that trajectory is going to take us from form into transform and finally into formless. And so to understand Christology, for example, we first have to understand what preceded it. Christology has roots that came far before it. And so to understand Christology, we have to first understand its historical roots, and the things that we're talking about regarding the biblical narrative are going to be very, very much grounded in history. So what are we talking about when we first of all talk about form? The trajectory is about, first of all, if you notice in formlessness, identity. This is where ultimately the narrative is taking humans, and that is, what is our identity? So when Dr. Martin asked the question, can there be a theology without walls? We're really talking about that which is ultimate for all religions, and every religion has a name for ultimacy. The biblical narrative, ultimacy, is that which is called God. God is in the realm of formlessness. There are no walls with regard to spirit. You cannot separate God. You cannot divide God. God is that which is formless. And that, we are saying, is what true identity is in relationship with. But identity of the human was not understood that way at all. If you go back to this first circle, you see that I have identity understood through form. And I want to talk about that. Mostly today, I'm going to talk about that, because once you understand the basis of form and identity, you're going to have a much greater appreciation of Christology as a transcending form movement that points away from itself to God, which is formlessness, and that Christology has a particular role and function within history, and that role and function has been completed and has left all humanity with an identity related to ultimacy, meaning that my identity is God identity. How do I know that? Because of the story that talks about identity in form, and because of the work, the transform work of Christology. We'll talk more about Christology, but a couple of quick things right off the bat. For 2,000 years, Christology has been interpreted as another form. In other words, what we've said is that we start with a realm of form that has to do with the religion of Moses and all that goes with that. We'll talk about that a little more in a second. But what happened was Jesus came and he introduced a better form, a new form. And so we now have a form called Christianity that displaced the previous form called Judaism. So this is not what we're seeing in the narrative. We are not understanding that Jesus came to bring more form. We're saying that Jesus's whole role and function was transformative. A transformative role would be one whereby I'm dying to my previous understanding of identity, but I'm rising to a new understanding of identity. Dying and rising is a transformative process that has a fixed moment in history. For example, Jesus, as the Christ individually, has a fixed moment in history of the cross being a dying experience, a tomb experience, and then a resurrection from the tomb. A one-time and for all occurrence. Christology, though, the second point I would make here is Christology is not just Christ as an individual transformative movement, but Christology is also a collective. That's why we'll talk about the term body of Christ in this. You have both Christ as individual transformation and Christ as a term of collective transformation. And to have a whole or integral picture of Christology, you have to talk about both Christ as an individual and Christ as a body. The body of Christ also, we will see as we dig deeply into Christology, it had a specific historical context. Transform is never meant to go through history, or it is another form. And so that's what we're going to develop more as we go along. But I want to go back to form and form identity. Let's look at form in terms of what I've got there, role and function. Look at a couple examples here of how form is role and function. So for example, I am a husband. That is a role and function. I am a father, a grandfather, role and function. I'm the CEO of Presence. That's a role and function. All these are roles and functions. But that is not my identity. So we have to understand the difference between a role and function and an identity. Now the question is, where is Jesus the Christ and the body Christ? And that's where we're saying that it plays a role in function. It was never intended to be an identity, that it points away from itself to that which is identity, and that which is identity is called God. Theos. That is the biblical narrative's definition of ultimacy. And so we're saying that transform and Christology plays the final piece of role and function. It is fulfilling everything that came before it and pointing to something new, a new creation, a new Jerusalem, a new heaven and earth, and we'll talk about that more. And that space, by the way, is God's space. So in looking at form, we know that in the creation, for example, when the narrative in Genesis talks about the creation, the first thing it says is that it was void and without form. So what does God have to do? God has to separate, the way the story is told, ocean and ocean creatures from land and land creatures, from the air and the birds and the creatures of the air. Why? Because for us human beings, we're in a biological form. To navigate this world, we have to understand form and differentiate form. Have to know how to use form. And there are thousands upon thousands of forms that we use every day, and lots of forms we're using right this minute to do this particular video. So form is a necessary thing. And when you look at Adam, I believe that Adam, at the end of creation, represents humanity as void and without form until the opening of the eyes. And for Adam and his eye-opening experience, he was introduced to form through the attempt to grasp the knowledge of good and evil. To grasp good and evil, one would have to put good in one box or form and evil in another box or form. Humanity has been trying to do that ever since Adam. And as Dr. Phil would say, how's that working for you? In other words, human beings, we don't agree on what's good and evil. As a matter of fact, in your lifetime and my lifetime, we all have changed our minds about things with regard to good, bad, healthy, unhealthy, functional, dysfunctional. All of that has its roots in this good, evil type paradigm, this dualistic paradigm, and it's necessary. It's necessary for me to try to distinguish what are the things that are good and what are the things that are bad. What are behaviors that are good? What are behaviors that are evil? However, the attempt to grasp that means that I put it into a form by which I am identified and by which I identify you. Are you good or are you evil? Now, how this is going to play itself out in Christology is it will eventually lead to the concretization of good and evil as forms, and that will be called creed and dogma. That's how good and evil will work its way out at the end here. And when you read Theology Without Walls in the book and all that, people have a real aversion, postmoderns have a real aversion to creed and dogma. When you talk about creed and dogma, what are most people thinking about? Their minds are immediately going back to, oh, that's fundamentalism. And I came from that and I've evolved beyond that. Now, if I talk to someone who is in a fundamentalist denomination, they will say creed and dogma is the main point. That you have to understand correctly, you have to interpret correctly, that your God identity is determined by the correctness of the form, meaning your denomination, and how it properly understands God identity. And then you have to do, because in the realm of form requires doing. What do I mean by that? Well, I have to make sure that I'm in the form called obedient rather than being outside the form and being disobedient. Or I need to be in the form called faithful rather than being outside the form, and then I'd be unfaithful. And so this good and evil that starts with Adam and the attempt to grasp it is an attempt to achieve and maintain identity through the use of form. Does this mean that we do not anymore have those things that are good or even things that we might call evil? No. What it means is that instead of good and evil being an identity, good and evil is that in which I grow. I grow in my understanding of it, but I don't grasp it or claim I have grasped it for the purpose of God identity. That is an enormous shift, and we will talk about that more later. I just want to kind of introduce that at this time with form. So the two forms that are behind all other forms are good and evil. And once we get out to formlessness rather than grasping, we're growing. Formlessness will be more organic. That's why you'll see in the biblical narrative a term like fruits of the Spirit. Fruits, it's organic, it's about growth. What is growth? Growth is all about transformation, a process of transformation from seed to plant to flower. This is the whole point of the narrative. This is the way nature works. It's the nature of nature, if you will. And the same is true for form and formlessness, the movement of it. Let's talk just for a minute about another chart I've got on good old Father Abraham. Let me pull him up. And a question to ask. Abrahamic studies is big in universities and seminaries. And the question when we get to Theology Without Walls is, do we think Father Abraham is a blessing to all nations or the contested founder of three world religions, three forms? And so if we were using this trajectory, starting with Father Abraham, then we would see that there is a twofold promise to Abraham. And that is, first of all, the promise was, I will make of you a great nation, singular. The evolution of spiritual consciousness begins in the realm of form and great nation singular is in the realm of form, because that's the nation that comes from Abraham's grandson Jacob, whose name is changed to Israel. And that calling of Israel to begin the evolutionary process was to educate, reveal, and enlighten humans to the form process, if you will. So Israel understands her identity purely in terms of form. Genealogy is a real good example of this. You have in genealogy all 12 tribes, and I'm tracing my ancestry, and that's why it's important for me to know what tribe I'm from and what my ancestry is, and my whole identity is tied up in my tribal genealogical form, and that's where God identity is. And Israel identified herself with God and moved along in her understanding of God with relation to form. Adam began as the individual human, and so we might say that initially the trajectory is egocentric, Adam, and what he attempted to do. Then we get into Israel, and so we move to ethnocentric, and then we finally move to world-centric. That is because the second part of the promise to Abraham was, I will make of you, or through you, I will bless all nations. So when we get to the end of the story, we're going to find there's this new space, this new heaven and earth space, and all nations of the earth are said to walk in the light of it. And when we say in the light of it, what we'll see is there's no night there. So this formlessness is pure light, no division, no darkness, no separation like there was in the first creation where there's the sun for the day and the moon at night. There's no division there. It's purely formlessness. God is light. We are children of light. And so you have all nations walking in the light. So that's just a little bit of a field to show that the intent of the biblical narrative was not for Abraham to eventually work out a trajectory whereby we get three world religions. If you look at some of the other elements of form that were in Israel, for example, the land. Israel was promised a land, right? So they go into the promised land. They're identified with their land. This is why when Israel is exiled from the land, as in the Babylonian captivity, their identity has been devastated. This is why Daniel the prophet cries out to God for restoration, because Israel's identity was a part of that land promise. And the city of Jerusalem. The city of Jerusalem was very much a form. It had city walls, and it was built by people, as all forms relate to that which comes from human doing. Formlessness has to do with God as source, whereas form will have to do with the self or human as source. And so if I look at Jerusalem and the land today, look at the situation. You have three world religions occupying that area and that city, and there's very sharp division between the three, and the land is in constant back and forth about boundaries, and it all has to do with particular identities. And so there are walls there. Now, in the beginning, as I said, in the realm of form, and let's go back to that. In the realm of form, form has with it certain elements. First of all, you have to have boundaries to have a form. If I want to have a box, I need boundaries that identify that box. God takes a creation that's without form and uses a process of separation in order to have organized form. So the first thing I would say in Theology Without Walls is this: the beginning of human consciousness, human spiritual consciousness, required walls. It required walls. We had to have walls and we had to have separation. Why? In order to be able to differentiate. Differentiation is a part of navigating life, and it is necessary until we get to identity. And this is where the trajectory is going to take us, and that is that we cannot confuse form, the use of form, with identity, because then we get into attachment to form. And if I attach to a form as my identity, there's a problem. If you've ever heard, for example, of the empty nest syndrome, that's where a mom or a dad has attached to the role and function of mom or dad. And when the children are gone, they're devastated. Who am I? I've been a mom or a dad my whole life. Now the kids are going, who am I? Who are we? Or if you lose your job, you've worked somewhere, it's been part of your vocation, you lose your job, and you're very much identified with your job, you're having one of those questions of who am I? Because that is common to attach to form as an identity. This is exactly what's happened when we take Christology out 2,000 years as a form, because form requires division. I must divide this form from that form in order to understand the identity of both forms. So when we get into denominationalism, by the time we get out to 2020, where we all live now, there are thousands of forms, all of which claim to be Christian, which is a religious interpretation of Christology. And so in that sense, you are attaching to form. You are differentiating yourself from all others on the planet with regard to identity. Now, there are other things that are involved in form. If we're going to have a form and it's going to have boundaries, then we have to have law. Why do I have to have the law? The law comes in because you have to adjudicate the boundaries to make sure the integrity of the boundary is kept, so that the boundary is not violated. So we have boundaries. We have boundaries to this day that are all over the place. We have boundaries that say you can't go more than 25 miles an hour in a school zone. That's a boundary. How do we adjudicate that? We have courts and we have judges. Judgment is necessary in the realm of form. Judgment is absolutely necessary in the realm of form, because we must judge whether or not the person has remained inside the boundaries of the form. And if they violate the boundaries, and we're talking about it from a religious standpoint, we get the word sin. Amartia is the Greek, and it means to miss the mark, which is saying violate a boundary. Now here's the problem, and that is, which group of humans determines what the mark is? This is how you end up with thousands of denominations. Everybody, no one can, it's like trying to put good and evil in a box and we all agree on it. It's saying this is the mark and this is the way it's kept. This is the problem with using law and form for identity. It cannot work. It will always lead to then the walls of those forms being separators between people. So we have law that's used for the adjudication of boundary. How many times was Jesus asked the question, is it lawful? Is it lawful? So you have a boundary, and the boundary is you are to keep the Sabbath day holy. Okay, that's the boundary. Well, when you are so focused on keeping the boundary, and that's your primary way of identification, that I want to be obedient as an identity, then even when Jesus heals somebody, does this amazing thing on the Sabbath day, rather than talk about how amazing it is that Jesus healed someone, the first question is it lawful to heal someone on the Sabbath? Why? Because form and form identity and attachment to that form obedient becomes all important. And so I have to make sure that I've remained within that form. And so what do we end up doing if we're a Pharisee group? Judging, 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 judging. What is it that upsets people about fundamentalist believers? One of the first things people will say is, oh, they're so judgmental. Well, the reason they're judgmental is because they believe that identity must be tied to the appropriate form. And that if that appropriate form is not kept through human doing, human obedience, human interpretation, human understanding, and you're outside that form, then you have lost your God identity. And so you are heretic. You are apostate. This is attachment to form in the realm of religion. All religions are form because they're all boundary driven. Christianity is a form, and because form begets form, and we know that form is a realm of begetting, because this is genealogy. We already said genealogy is a form, and read the Gospels and how they start in Matthew and Mark. So-and-so begat, begat, begat. Form is a realm of begetting. If you say, for example, you must keep the Sabbath day, that has set up a boundary. But it doesn't end, see? It begets. Why? Because someone says, well, what if the ox goes in the ditch? Can I get it out? Oh, we need another law. Oh, wait a minute. Can I bake bread if I don't have anything to eat? Oh, we need another law. If I'm eating my bread and it falls on the floor, can I pick it up? We need another law. And on we go. Form begets form, boundary begets boundary, and we continue to have boundaries that we will judge other people by. Oh, I notice you, blah, 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 blah. And so, again, this is identity with regard to form and form attachment. And this is why you must have law. Now, this is not a bad thing. We have to have forms. We have to have law. We have to have boundaries. In the realm of role and function. But law and boundaries do not belong in identity. When we put boundaries between ourselves and others, we have taken it upon ourselves to say, there are certain criteria you must meet and keep in order to have God identity. Now, it's a whole different thing for me to understand that the entire planet, the entire creation of God, shares God identity, but some of us may be more conscious of it than others. It's okay to say that there are people on the planet that are very unconscious of the identity they are. But when I start saying that there are certain things you must do to achieve and maintain God identity, I have backed up into the realm of form. And that was the first experience that humans had, was through Israel, who brought this understanding of form. Eventually, we get form all the way out to a box called saved and a box called lost. And that has been a very primary use of form in the Christological interpretation of Jesus as a religion. Attachment to form brings arrested development. Theology without walls is difficult because of religious attachments. Jerry Martin quote that I'd like to read. Jerry Martin says, and I read this last week, to treat the world as containing a number of block phenomena called religions is useful for textbooks, but we know it is not quite accurate. Jerry Martin is saying there's a problem with this block phenomena called religion, meaning every religion's a block. The same is true of denominations. They're just block phenomena. Now, who determines whether or not you are a heretic or apostate or a faithful member or an obedient member of a particular denomination? Who determines that? People determine that. And that becomes your identity. Faithful, unfaithful, saved, lost, heretic, true believer, etc. And that's what comes with this use of judgment, which is required. Judgment is always required in the realm of form. So, what we're going to do as we move forward is talk about the movement from form into the realm of transform. And let me say a couple words about that in closing for this particular session. One of the primary forms that Israel attached to for her God identity was the temple. And the temple itself was a form. It had walls. And inside those walls were two forms called the Holy Place and the Holy of Holies. And inside the form called Holy of Holies was the dwelling of God, as Israel understood God. So for Israel, God was other. God was within these walls. And there was a separation consciousness. And that separation consciousness is why the paradigm of sin and death was such a huge part of the biblical narrative, and why the transform work of Christology was to do away with sin and death as a way of thinking, as a paradigm of thinking. Sin and death can only exist in the realm of form. You can only sin if you miss a mark or violate a boundary, and you can only have death if you're separated, and you can't be separated unless there's a wall of separation there. So it was necessary for Israel to begin her understanding on behalf of all people, because I'm benefiting today from Israel's experience, and it was the necessary foundation from which my understanding comes. There was nothing wrong with what Israel did in having temple and priesthood and sacrificial system. That was appropriate to that level of consciousness at that time in history. So we can say that Adam played a role in function, Abraham played a role in function, Moses played a role in function, David, as well as Jesus played a role in function. And that all of them were pointing away from the self to that which is beyond the self, transcendent of the self, as the narrative calls it, God, the formless, and that is where identity, of course, is to be found, as we've said quite a few times. So the temple becomes very much a part of Israel's identity, and it's an outward manifestation of the collective's internal consciousness. What I mean by that is that consciousness of a collective is found in its artifacts. So an archaeologist who is looking at artifacts is going to be able to tell a lot from those artifacts about the consciousness of the people who made them. And that temple was an indication of what they thought internally regarding their separation from God. And so what did they try to do? They always tried to be pleasing to God, not displeasing, as a matter of identity, as a matter of being able to maintain their place in the land, as a way of maintaining their standing before God. And this is why at the end of each king and their reign, when you read the Hebrew writings, they will generally say this king reigned X number of years and did that which was pleasing in the sight of God, or did that which was displeasing. The realm of form was that dualistic, based on good and evil from the beginning, way of seeing and understanding identity. Once we get out to Christology, we're going to see that Christ as individual and Christ as body is going to die to the realm of form. This is because the realm of form will always have to do with self, with the human self as source. Humans were the ones who built a temple. But even though they built that form, King Solomon from the very beginning said, nevertheless, God does not dwell in buildings made with hands. That was also repeated by Stephen as he was being stoned to death. And we find the same thing said by the writer of Hebrews. Nevertheless, God does not dwell in buildings made with hands. God does not dwell within the walls. This is why Jerry Martin is encouraging us to think about theology without walls, because that is the nature of God as ultimacy. There can be no walls when we're talking about that which is ultimate. It does not dwell in form. Form is always going to be related to that which comes from the human self. And this is why when we get into Christology here next week, I'll probably refer to some of the work of Dr. Paul Knitter, who wrote the book, Without Buddha, I Could Not Be a Christian. And what he's calling attention to is the problems of the self when we try to have our identity through the self rather than the no self, which Buddhism calls anatta. We'll talk about that next week. Jesus is putting to death the self. And this will be death to the highest form for a human. And that's my biological form, because my mind cannot grasp how I can still exist if I allow this form of biology to no longer exist. Did I not just completely lose my identity? This is the struggle in the garden that makes Jesus sweat, as it were, drops of blood, because he's dealing with the ultimate form question. Who am I beyond my biological form? And it will be the faith of Christ that will lead the way in understanding that we are more than form, and that our identity is not to be attached to form. And so we're going to talk about Christology a whole lot in the next session. And it will make a lot more sense if we're going to talk transform, it'll make a lot more sense that we first understand form and the issues around attachment to form as a way of attempting to have God identity. So I'm going to end the session here for right now. Next week, or the next time you view, session number 3 will be specifically what did the role of Christ, the individual, and the role of Christ, the collective body, what did it do in the realm of transform that delivered humanity into the realm of formlessness, rather than once again, as we have done historically, move into simply reformation, reform, and keep ourselves in bondage to form, we're going to ask, what is the glorious liberty found in the new creation that's delivered into the realm of the formless? And what does that mean to be in the realm of the formless? So thank you for joining us in session number 2. Hope you found this useful and hope you'll join us next time. Thank you.